Hello, my name is Valeria. This is my new original story on my channel. Subscribe and enjoy.
The Alpha King watched her get thrown in the dungeon. He said nothing. Then the truth came out. The morning it all began, Nora was thinking about whether the kitchen had restocked the rye loaves. Not about fate. Not about the cold that had settled into the stone walls of Velthorn Keep overnight, pressing through the old mortar and filling the corridors with the kind of damp that lived in your joints for days after. Not about the territorial summit that would begin at sundown, the most significant gathering of northern pack leaders in a decade, the one that had brought 24 alphas and their retinues flooding into the keep over the past 3 days, until every corridor smelled of pine resin, leather, and the particular tension that gathered in rooms where powerful men were trying very hard to appear relaxed. She was thinking about bread, whether there would be enough for the morning service, whether old Martin in the kitchen would remember that the Western delegation had requested no salt in their morning portions, a dietary preference that Nora had personally communicated twice, and that she fully expected to be ignored. Whether her left boot, which had begun separating at the heel the week before, would hold through another full shift, or whether she would spend the afternoon with wet feet again. These were the calculations of her life. Small, practical, entirely unglamorous. My name is Nora. I am 22 years old. I have worked the serving staff of Velthorn Keep since I was 17, when my mother brought me here from the outer settlement and arranged the position through a woman she knew in the household staff, a favor owed from years before, that my mother cashed in without ceremony and without explaining to me exactly what it had cost her to hold on to it for so long. I carry trays for a living. I pour wine. I clear plates. I learn which lords prefer their meat rare and which request it well cooked, which dignitaries cannot tolerate the smell of garlic, and which will slip an extra coin into your palm if you bring them a second dessert before they have finished the first. I make myself useful. I make myself quiet. I make myself, as my supervisor Wren has always instructed, invisible. Invisible was the goal. Invisible was the achievement. And for 5 years, I had been very, very good at it. The morning of the summit, I was assigned to the East Corridor service, the long stretch of hallways nearest to the great assembly hall where the proceedings would take place. My shift began before the sun had fully risen, when the keep was still cold, and the torches in the iron wall brackets were burning low. I loaded my first tray in the kitchen, nodded to Seth, who handled the morning bread, and began the long, quiet work of the day. I had noticed things over the years, not by design, simply by nature. When you are invisible, you see more than people expect. You learn the geography of a room before you cross it. You track which conversations shift pitch when a certain person enters. You catalog the small tells that distinguish genuine laughter from performed laughter, and there is always a difference in rooms like these. The Western delegation was the first thing I registered. 4 figures in deep copper and charcoal, positioned at the far end of the corridor, where it bent toward the smaller council antechamber. They were not eating. They were not yet dressed for the formal opening. They were standing very still and speaking in voices so low that even in the quiet of the early morning, I could only catch fragments. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with close-cropped silver hair and a scar that ran from his left eye to the edge of his jaw, glanced up when I passed with my tray. His gaze stayed on me for exactly 2 seconds. The specific, flat assessment of a man calculating whether something he sees is relevant to him. I dropped my eyes and kept moving. I had learned long ago that the fastest way to become invisible again, after being noticed, was not to look away first, but to continue exactly what you were doing, as though being seen had not registered at all. A person who reacts looks like they have something to react to. A person who simply continues looks like furniture. I continued. I served the first corridor, refilled the water pitchers, collected the previous evening's glassware from the sideboard near the east stairs, carried it all back to the kitchen, and loaded a second tray. The second thing I noticed, around mid-morning when the keep had fully woken, and the corridors were busy with staff and retinue members moving between chambers, was the conversation outside the linen storage room. I had stopped to straighten the tablecloths on a sideboard near the narrow storeroom door, which stood ajar, which was why I heard it. Two voices, both male. One of them I recognized as Aldrich, the king's senior council advisor, a tall man with pale eyes, and the specific manner of someone who has spent 30 years being the most competent person in every room, and has stopped trying to conceal the fact that he knows it. The other voice I did not recognize. What I heard lasted perhaps 20 seconds. Long enough. I did not move. I did not breathe in any way that would carry sound. I stood with my hands on the tablecloth, and I listened to 20 seconds of a conversation that no one had intended for me to hear. Then I straightened the cloth, lifted my tray, and walked away. My hands were steady. I had learned very early in this work how to keep my hands steady when my mind was doing something entirely different. It was a useful skill. It was, at that moment, the most important skill I possessed. I spent the rest of the morning deciding what to do with what I had heard. By the time the afternoon preparation service began, I had arrived at the only conclusion that made sense. Nothing. I would do nothing. I was a waitress. I had no rank, no bloodline worth mentioning, no standing before any council or any lord. If I walked to the king's chamber and asked to speak to someone in his guard, I would be turned away before I finished a sentence. If I found a way past the guard and managed to say what I had heard, I would be asked immediately how I had come to hear it, and the answer, standing in a restricted corridor listening at a door that was technically none of my business, would not serve me well. And beyond all of that, the practical reality of it was this. I did not know King Calder, not personally, not in any way that would give my words weight in a room where every other person had title, history, and alliance behind them. I had served in his keep for 5 years, and in that time, I had seen him at a distance exactly 7 times, at 3 formal banquets, where I worked the outer corridor and never entered the hall itself, twice from across the main courtyard, once on the east stairs, when I had pressed myself flat against the wall, while he passed with 4 guards, and did not look in my direction, and once in a back corridor, near the old kitchen, almost 3 weeks ago now, which was a memory I had been deliberately not thinking about since it happened. I set that memory aside again and focused on the tray in front of me. By evening, the great assembly hall was ready. 40 tables arranged in the traditional northern formation, a wide horseshoe with the high table at its open end. Candles everywhere, hundreds of them, in iron and glass and silver, filling the vaulted space with warm, moving light that made the stone walls glow amber and turned the banners of the assembled packs into something more vivid than they were in ordinary light. The smell of roasted meat and pine smoke, and the dark wine from the western cellars, I worked the inner corridor nearest the high table. Wren had assigned me there because I was, as she always said, steady-handed and forgettable. I tried, that evening, to be both. The summit opened with the formal reading of territorial boundaries, which took nearly an hour and required 2 separate disputes to be noted for morning resolution. Then came the Alliance Renewal Declarations, which I had heard performed at 3 previous summits, and which followed an identical pattern each time, pledges of fealty delivered in language so old it had become almost ceremonial, each delegation in turn, beginning from the furthest eastern pack and working in geographic order toward the north. The western delegation went last. I was pouring wine at the 3rd table from the high platform when their head delegate, the silver-haired man I had seen in the corridor that morning, rose to deliver the Western pledge. He was smooth, practiced. His voice carried without effort across the length of the hall. He spoke the old words with the ease of someone who had memorized them young and had never needed to think about them since. I filled the goblet in front of me. I moved to the next. I was watching the high table. King Calder sat at its center, as he always did at these gatherings, flanked by Aldrich on his right, and his war captain Brennan on his left. Calder himself was not what I had expected the first time I had seen him clearly, at the first banquet I worked after coming to the keep. I had expected someone who looked the part in the theatrical sense, someone broad and golden, and obviously powerful, in the way that children imagine kings when they hear the word. What I saw instead was a man who was large and still and watchful, in the way that genuinely dangerous things tend to be, the way a deep river is more concerning than a noisy one. Dark hair, jaw that looked carved rather than grown, pale gray eyes that moved across the room in slow, systematic assessments that never seemed to land on anything without meaning it. He was listening to the Western delegate. His face was the particular kind of neutral that I had learned meant he was paying close attention. I should not have been watching him. It was precisely the kind of thing that could be noticed. I dropped my eyes and moved to the next table. It happened 11 minutes later. I know the time because I had just glanced at the iron clock mounted in the far wall, a nervous habit I had developed that evening, checking as though time itself was marking something. 11 minutes after the Western delegate finished speaking, Aldrich rose from his seat at the high table, crossed to the edge of the raised platform, and raised his voice across the assembled hall. "Before we proceed to the evening's second portion," he said, "there is a matter of theft that requires immediate address." I stopped moving. The hall shifted in that particular way that rooms do when everyone simultaneously decides to be very still. "A member of the serving staff," Aldrich continued, his pale eyes moving across the room with deliberate slowness, "has been found to be in possession of an item that belongs to the royal household, an item of significant importance." He paused. "The seal ring of the Iron Compact." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. The Iron Compact seal was not merely a piece of jewelry. Every person in that hall understood what it was. A 300-year-old ring, bearing the original stamp of the founding alliance between the northern packs, the legal instrument by which a reigning Alpha King could formalize territorial agreements that would bind his successors. Without it, no treaty signed at this summit would carry its full historical authority. Without it, certain provisions of the territorial agreement being finalized tonight could be challenged by any pack that chose to argue the point. I set my tray down on the sideboard behind me. I did not look up. Aldrich's gaze had found me. "The girl at the East Corridor service," he said. "Bring her forward." I have thought many times since that night about what it felt like to walk the length of that hall. It is difficult to describe in a way that is accurate rather than dramatic. I did not feel fear the way I had expected fear to feel, the rushing, loud version I had always imagined. What I felt was something slower, the specific quiet that comes when the thing you have been most careful to avoid has arrived anyway, and you are past the point where being careful is relevant. Every set of eyes in that room was on me, every alpha from every northern territory, every delegate, advisor, guard. 200 people in candlelit stillness, watching a girl in a plain gray dress and white apron walk the length of the hall with her hands at her sides. I walked steadily. I would not run. I would not stumble. I would give them nothing extra. Aldrich met me at the base of the platform steps. Behind him, King Calder had not moved from his seat at the high table. He was watching. His gray eyes were on me, and they were completely unreadable. "Empty your pockets," Aldrich said. I did. Lint. A folded cloth. 2 small coins that constituted the only personal items I kept on my person during a shift. "Your apron," he said. I untied it and handed it over. Aldrich reached into the deep front pocket of the apron, the large one designed to hold a folding cloth, a small notebook, whatever a server needed to keep close during a long shift. He withdrew his hand. In it was the ring. The silence deepened. I looked at the ring. The iron band, worn smooth from centuries of handling, the stamp on its face catching the candlelight. I had never seen it before in my life. I had never touched it. I did not know how it had come to be in a pocket I had been wearing against my body for the past 4 hours without feeling it placed there. I looked up at King Calder. He looked at me. His face was the same careful neutral it had been all evening. He did not speak. He did not rise. He did not say anything in my defense, or offer any expression that suggested doubt, or give me any signal of any kind. He simply looked at me, and then looked away. "Remove her," he said. "Dungeon level, holding cell 4. We will address the matter after proceedings close." The 2 guards at the edge of the platform were already moving. I did not speak. There was nothing I could have said in that room, in that moment, that would have been heard as anything other than a servant's attempt to talk her way out of a charge. I had nothing. No proof. No witness. No standing. I let them take my arms, and I walked out of that hall with my chin level. The last thing I saw before the doors closed behind me was Aldrich, returning to his seat at the high table, his pale eyes finding me one final time across the full length of the room. He pressed something into my hand as the guards passed him. So fast, so practiced, that neither guard registered it. I felt the paper in my palm and closed my fist around it before I understood what I was doing. The hall doors shut. If you have ever wanted to know what it feels like to watch someone's life change in a single evening, then you are watching the right story. And if you want to know what that piece of paper said and why it changed everything, stay with this. We are only at the beginning. The dungeon level of Valthorn Keep was not built for comfort. It had been designed several centuries earlier, during a period of frequent territorial conflict, and it retained the functionality of that era, without any of the modifications that might have made it less brutal in the centuries since. The walls were raw stone, moisture dark and cold. The torches in the corridor were spaced far enough apart that the light between them was dim without being entirely absent. a calculation that I suspected was intentional. Enough visibility to function, not enough to forget where you were. Cell 4 was at the far end. The guard who led me there was young, maybe 19, and he had the posture of someone who was trying very hard to look like this was routine. He unlocked the cell without speaking. Iron bars, a stone floor, a narrow ledge along the back wall that served as the approximation of a sleeping surface. He closed the door behind me. The lock turned. His footsteps retreated down the corridor. I sat on the ledge and waited until I could no longer hear him. Then I opened my fist. The paper was small, folded twice. I smoothed it against my knee and held it toward the thin strip of torchlight that came through the bars from the corridor. 7 words. Do not open your mouth. Stay alive. And beneath it, 2 letters. C. A. I sat with that for a long time. Calder Ashenvale. The Alpha King. The man who had just ordered me thrown in a cell in front of 200 pack leaders. I turned the note over. Nothing on the reverse. The paper itself was plain, the kind that could have come from anywhere. The handwriting was small and controlled, the compressed precision of someone who had learned to write in a limited amount of space, and had never since expanded. I thought about the 20 seconds I had overheard outside the linen storage room that morning. Then I thought about 3 weeks ago. I had been trying very hard not to think about 3 weeks ago. It had been the kind of night that feels ordinary until it does not. I had finished a late shift in the outer kitchen wing and was taking the back route to the servant quarters. The passage that ran along the outside of the old east wall, narrow and poorly lit, that most of the staff avoided after dark because it was longer than the inner route and offered less shelter from the wind. I used it because it was always empty, and there were evenings when I needed the particular kind of quiet that came from being somewhere no one else was. He was on the ground against the wall, half beneath the stone overhang where the roof extension met the outer rampart. I almost stepped over him. For a single, genuine second, I almost walked past. Because a man on the ground in a dark passage in a keep during a tense political period was not something you stopped to investigate if you were a 22-year-old serving girl with no protection and good survival instincts. Then he moved slightly, and I heard the sound, the specific shallow quality of breathing that means something is wrong. I stopped. He was large, even curled partially on his side. I could read the scale of him, the breadth of shoulder, the length. His clothing was dark and plain, no obvious insignia, the kind that might belong to anyone, which told me very little. His dark hair was matted against his forehead. On his left side, just below the ribcage, the fabric of his shirt was soaked through. I looked both ways down the passage. Empty. I crouched. He was conscious. Barely. His eyes opened when I touched his shoulder, and what I saw there was the flat gray of a mind that had retreated to its most functional core, processing only survival data, everything else suspended. He looked at me without recognition, which made sense because he had presumably never seen me before in his life. I assessed what I could see of the wound without moving him. A blade injury, not wide, but deep. The kind that suggested it had been delivered by someone who knew what they were doing and had perhaps been interrupted before they could finish. The bleeding had slowed, which was the best available news. He was cold, which was not. I did what I had been doing since I could remember, in every small emergency that had crossed my path in 5 years of working a keep, where emergencies had a way of occurring quietly, and often. I made a practical assessment, and I acted on it. I tore the lower portion of my underskirt, which was clean, and pressed it against the wound. I found the pulse at his throat, counted it, found it functional. I pulled my outer cloak off and arranged it over him, which would help with the cold, less than a fire would, but more than nothing. And then, because his hands were loose at his sides, and because I had been raised to the particular instinct that says you do not leave a sick person's valuables where anyone could take them, I checked his hands. On the first finger of his right hand was a ring. Iron, wide, old. A stamp on its face that I did not, at the time, recognize. I removed it carefully, found the thin cord at my own neck that held a small token I had carried since childhood, unknotted it, threaded the ring onto the cord, and retied it. He would not lose it now. He would not lose anything now. I went to find help. I told the gate guard I had found an injured man in the East Passage, gave the location, and left before any questions could follow me back to anything. I did not give my name. By the time anyone arrived with a lantern, I was 3 corridors away, moving fast, my hands washed clean in the water bucket by the kitchen door. I had not allowed myself to think about it again. Until now. I sat in cell 4 with the note in my hand and understood, in the specific way that understanding sometimes arrives, completely and all at once, why King Calder had not spoken for me in that hall. He knew I had the ring. He had known since the moment he woke up in whatever room they had carried him to that night 3 weeks ago, and worked out that a serving girl had removed it to keep it safe, and had never returned it because she did not know who he was, and had no way to know. He had spent 3 weeks looking for it quietly, because announcing that the iron compact seal was missing was not a thing a king could do without immediately triggering every political complication that such an announcement would produce. And tonight, someone else had also been looking for it. Someone who had searched my uniform, found an empty pocket, and arranged for a convincing replica to be placed there instead, to force the issue, to have me searched publicly, to get the real ring exposed and into their own hands before the treaty signing tomorrow. Aldrich had pressed that replica into the pocket of my apron himself, during the one moment today when we had physically passed each other in the narrow corridor by the east stairs, the moment I had registered as insignificant because I had been thinking about bread. But the replica was not the real ring. The real ring was on a cord around my neck, and had been for 3 weeks, and Calder knew it. And tonight, he had let Aldrich spring his trap and find nothing useful, because Aldrich finding a replica and believing he had succeeded was more valuable to Calder than stopping the accusation. He had used me. He had let me walk through that hall in front of every pack leader in the Northern Territories, had let me be accused and removed and locked in a stone cell, because it was the most efficient way to protect the real ring until morning, and expose Aldrich at the same time. I sat with that knowledge, and breathed carefully, and tried to decide how I felt about it. The answer was complicated. The other answer, underneath that one, was he had warned me. 7 words in a small hand, pressed into my palm in the only second available to him, before the guards took me away. Do not open your mouth. Stay alive. It was not an apology. It was not an explanation. It was the only practical thing he could offer in that moment, without compromising the plan. And it was exactly what I would have needed most, if I had not already worked it out for myself. I folded the note and kept it. I lay down on the stone ledge and pulled my knees to my chest against the cold, and I did not sleep. but I kept my breathing steady, and I watched the thin strip of torchlight in the corridor, and I waited. Now, before we go any further, I need to ask you something directly. If you are watching this right now, and you are not yet subscribed to this channel, I want you to stop for one moment and think about the fact that you are in the middle of a story where a girl with a king's seal around her neck is locked in a dungeon while a traitor sits at the high table, and you do not yet know what happens at midnight. Do not leave now. Tap that subscribe button. Turn on the notification bell. Because what happens next in the hours before that treaty signing is the part of this story that no one in that keep anticipated. Not Aldrich, not Brennan, not the Western delegation, and not, I think, entirely even Calder himself. Stay. This is where it changes. He came at midnight. I heard the footsteps first. Not the heavy, regular pace of a guard. Something quieter, more deliberate. The tread of someone who had spent time learning how to move through stone corridors without producing the specific echo that stone corridors tend to produce. I was already sitting when the figure appeared in the torchlight outside my cell. He was alone. Plain, dark clothing. No insignia. The same studied anonymity I had seen 3 weeks ago in a different passage, under different circumstances. He had a key in his hand. He used it. The cell door opened. King Calder entered the space that was barely large enough for 2 people to stand in, without proximity, becoming something other than proximity. He did not sit. He stood with his back against the wall opposite the barred door, and looked at me in the particular way that he had been looking at me all evening, that direct, comprehensive assessment that offered nothing back. "You worked it out," he said. Not a question. "Yes," I said. He was quiet for a moment. I noticed that he had one hand pressed flat against his left side, the old automatic gesture of someone checking a wound they have stopped expecting to find. The same injury, 3 weeks healed but apparently not entirely forgotten by the muscle. "The ring," he said. I reached up and unfastened the cord from around my neck. I held it out. He did not take it immediately. He looked at it for a moment, in a way that I could not fully interpret. Then he reached forward and closed his hand around it, cord and all. "You could have given it back," he said, "any time in the last 3 weeks." "I did not know it was yours," I said. "When I found it, you were not in any condition to be identified. And when you were well enough to be identified, I did not know where you were, or how to return it, without drawing attention to the fact that I had been in a corridor at that hour in the first place." He considered that. "That is practical," he said. "It is honest," I said. He turned the ring in his fingers once. The iron caught the light from the corridor torch, the old stamp briefly visible. "Aldrich has been moving against the compact terms for 4 months," he said, and his voice had shifted into something more direct. The specific change that happens when a person decides to stop providing only the minimum required information. He made an arrangement with the Western delegation before this summit, a private amendment to the formal treaty that would reroute the river border and effectively give them a controlling position on the mountain crossing. The arrangement required the seal to be authenticated outside the formal proceedings. He needed the ring to stamp a secondary document tonight, before the treaty signing tomorrow, a document that would then be submitted as though it were a standard procedural attachment. I said, "And if the ring he found tonight was the replica?" "Then he would stamp the document with a seal that carries no legal authority," Calder said. "The amendment would be worthless. Worse than worthless, because the stamping itself would be evidence of what he attempted. I looked at him. "You knew about the arrangement 4 months ago," I said. "I suspected. The confirmation came 3 weeks ago, the evening I was found in your passage. Someone tried to kill you. An attempt to accelerate the timeline. If I was dead before the summit, the compact proceedings would have been delayed. The temporary council would have needed the seal to formalize any interim authority, and Aldrich controls the council." I thought about that. "The person who attacked you," I said, "is no longer a concern," he said. I did not ask for elaboration on that. Some answers are clear enough without specificity. He was still standing very close in the small space of the cell. The midnight keep was entirely silent around us, the deep quiet of stone buildings at the coldest hour. I could see the line of tension across his shoulders, the kind that does not come from the current moment, but from 4 months of holding something alone. "What happens tomorrow?" I said. "Aldrich will attempt the stamping tonight, discover the replica is worthless, and by morning he will either run or attempt to accelerate further." He paused. "I am counting on him choosing to run. The Western delegation is pragmatic. Without Aldrich to broker the arrangement, they will calculate their options and decide that a clean alliance with the existing terms is preferable to any association with a failed conspiracy. And if he accelerates?" Calder's gray eyes were steady. "Then I need someone in a position he will not expect to be significant." I understood what he was not saying. "Me," I said. "You have held that ring for 3 weeks, without using it, without selling it, without attempting to leverage it in any direction," he said, "in a keep full of people who have been maneuvering for months. That is either perfect loyalty or perfect patience. Either way, it is what I need in the room tomorrow." "I am a waitress," I said. "I know what you are," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that carried weight I was not prepared for. The specific weight of a person who means a thing more precisely than the words they chose are designed to carry. I held his gaze. "What do you need me to do?" I said. He told me. We talked for 40 minutes in that stone cell. Our voices kept low against the keep's silence, and by the time he rose to leave, I had a clear picture of the morning ahead, and exactly 2 points in the proceedings where my presence would matter. He told me the layout of the assembly hall, as it would be arranged for the formal treaty signing. He told me where Aldrich would be standing. He told me what the Western delegate's senior aide carried on his person, a detail he knew, and I did not question how. He told me exactly what I needed to do with the ring, and exactly when. Before he left, he stood for a moment in the cell doorway, with the key in his hand. "The accusation tonight," he said. "I know why it was necessary," I said. He looked at me for a moment without speaking. That same comprehensive assessment, and I had the sense of something being carefully evaluated. "It cost you something," he said. Not a question, not an apology. An acknowledgement, offered with the blunt directness of a person who does not perform contrition, but will recognize the truth of a thing. "It did," I said. He left the cell. He did not lock it behind him. I sat in the dark for another hour and thought about everything I now knew, and everything I still did not. And when the first faint gray light of early morning began to soften the stone around the torch brackets, I rose, straightened my dress, and walked out. The assembly hall at treaty signing hour. The 40 tables had been reconfigured. The horseshoe arrangement of the previous evening had been replaced with the formal parallel seating of the signing ceremony. 2 long tables facing each other across the central floor, with a clear space between them wide enough to walk, to be seen, to make whatever statements were made in the full visibility of every delegation present. I entered through the servants' entrance at the eastern wall. I was not, technically, supposed to be there. My status as of the previous evening was officially suspended pending investigation of the theft charge, which meant I had no assigned role in the morning's proceedings, which meant I was either invisible in the way that I had always been invisible, present but unregistered, or I was something considerably more conspicuous. I chose the edge of the room. I took a position near the sideboard by the east wall, a tray of water pitchers in hand, the most ordinary thing a person in this room could be holding. 3 minutes after I arrived, Wren appeared at my elbow. Her expression was the particular combination of professional relief and personal alarm that I had always found simultaneously touching and exhausting. "You are not supposed to be here," she said, her voice low. "I know," I said. She looked at the tray in my hands. She looked at my face. She had known me for 5 years. "Stay near the wall," she said, and walked away. I stayed near the wall. Aldrich arrived at the 6th hour. He was dressed formally, as he always was, the long, dark coat of a senior council advisor, the silver chain of his office at his collar. His pale eyes moved across the room in the automatic inventory of a man who has spent decades assessing spaces for threat and opportunity. They passed over me without stopping. I was furniture. I had always been very good at furniture. The delegations entered in sequence. The Western delegation arrived last, the silver-haired delegate, and his advisors taking their places at the far end of the left table. The senior aide, as Calder had described, was a compact man with a document satchel worn close across the body, the way you carry something you are not willing to set down. Calder entered from the north door with Brennan at his shoulder. He crossed to the head of the room without looking in my direction. He sat. He placed both hands flat on the table in front of him. He looked at the room with the same steady gray gaze that had been the last thing I saw before the hall doors closed last night. The formal proceedings began. The treaty clerk read the opening provisions. The delegations confirmed each in sequence. The language was old and careful, centuries of political refinement in every phrase, and the reading of it took time. I stood near the east wall and poured water when asked, and watched Aldrich. He was watching the Western aide. The aide was watching the clerk. There was a sequence here, a timing that I could see now that I knew what to look for. The formal treaty required the seal at the conclusion of the reading, at the moment when the reigning Alpha King affixed his mark to the document in the presence of all assembled delegations. That moment was approaching, and before it arrived, Aldrich and the Western aide were waiting for a different moment, a procedural pause in the reading of the Eastern boundary provisions, 3 minutes of technical recitation, during which the clerk's attention was on the document, and not the room, during which the formal witnesses would be looking at each other, during which a secondary document could be produced and stamped and returned to the satchel in the time it took a person to pour a glass of water. I had 2 minutes. I moved away from the east wall. I crossed the clear space between the tables. I did not hurry. A person who hurries is a disruption. A person who moves with deliberate purpose is simply someone going somewhere. I came around the end of the right table, passing behind the Western delegation's chairs, and positioned myself at the far edge, adjacent to the space where the senior aide sat. The clerk reached the eastern boundary provisions. The aide reached for his satchel. I set my tray down on the corner of the table, directly in front of him, with the solid, definitive placement of someone rearranging a space they are responsible for. The tray occupied the surface where the secondary document would have been unfolded. The aide looked up. Our eyes met for 1 second. I held out my hand. On my palm was the ring. The real one. His eyes went to it, then back to my face, then to the ring again. Across the room, Aldrich had gone very still. I lifted my voice, not loud, not performing, simply placing words into the room with the clarity of someone who has decided that being heard is now the only option. "I believe this belongs at the head of the table," I said. And then I turned and walked the full length of the room toward King Calder. What I remember most clearly about that walk is not how long it was, or how quiet the room had become, though both of those things were true. What I remember is the specific quality of the silence, not the stunned silence of surprise, but something older, heavier, the silence of a room full of people simultaneously understanding that something they had watched developing had just resolved in a direction no one had prepared for. I reached the head of the table. Calder rose. I placed the ring on the surface in front of him. He looked at it. Then he looked at me, and for the first time that morning, the careful neutrality of his expression shifted, not into anything large or performed, but into something quieter, the specific, contained look of a person who has held a great deal in reserve and is, for one moment, not holding it. He picked up the ring. He turned to face the room. "This ring," he said, "has been in the care of a member of my household staff for 3 weeks, following an incident in which I required assistance, and she provided it, at personal risk, and without knowing who I was." He paused. The room was entirely still. Last night, a member of my own council arranged for her to be publicly accused of its theft, in an attempt to expose and seize it before this morning's proceedings. Every set of eyes in the room moved to Aldrich. Aldrich did not speak. His face had done the thing that faces do when a plan collapses, the very brief internal scramble before the external composure attempts to reassert itself. In this case, the composure did not fully reassemble. Brennan was already moving. "The secondary document in the Western delegation's satchel," Calder continued, his voice the same measured, carrying weight it always had, "carries a stamp from the replica seal, applied last night after the assembly, and is therefore without legal authority. The amendment it purports to record will be entered into the proceedings as evidence of the arrangement, and addressed accordingly." The Western delegate had gone pale in the way that practical men go pale when they have made a calculation that has just been revealed as incorrect in every dimension. Calder sat down. He placed the ring on his finger, the old iron settling into place with the ease of something returning home. He looked at me. He said, "Sit down, Nora." There was not, technically, a seat at the head of the treaty table for a serving girl in a plain gray dress. There was, however, a chair directly to his left, which belonged formally to his senior council advisor, which was currently unoccupied because Brennan had removed its previous occupant from the room. I sat down. The Western delegate cleared his throat and began a careful reformulation of his delegation's position. The clerk resumed the reading of the Eastern boundary provisions. The morning proceeded, and I sat at the head of the table in a plain gray dress, with my hands folded and my breathing steady, and I listened to the formal language of a treaty being read aloud, and I thought about bread and boots with worn heels and a cord around my neck that had carried something for 3 weeks without me knowing what it was. Afterward, in the quieter passage behind the assembly hall, when the delegations had dispersed and the formal proceedings had moved into the documentation phase, Calder found me in the corridor, where I had stopped to stand still for a moment and not be required to do anything. He stood at a reasonable distance and looked at me with that gray-eyed assessment that I was beginning to understand was less evaluation than attention. "You said you did not know who I was," he said, "when you found me." "I did not," I said. "And when you knew?" "I kept quiet," I said, as instructed. He was silent for a moment. "There is a question," he said, "that I have been sitting with since I woke up in a room 3 weeks ago and understood what had happened in that passage. I have not asked it because there has not been a moment when asking it was possible without it being overheard or misinterpreted or turned into something political. I waited. "Why did you stop?" he said. "You had every practical reason to walk past." I thought about it honestly, the way I had learned to think about things, without embellishment and without false modesty. "I heard a sound," I said. "The sound told me something was wrong. When something is wrong, and I can do something about it, I do." "That is it," he said. "That is it," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. The corridor was empty around us. Somewhere deeper in the keep, the distant sounds of the post-summit activity continued, voices and footsteps, and the particular busy noise of a large building returning to its ordinary functions. "I owe you something," he said, "more than an acknowledgement in a formal proceeding." "You do not owe me anything," I said. "I did not stop for payment." "I know that," he said. "That is part of what I am trying to address." I looked at him, the careful, direct way of him that I had been watching from a distance for 5 years, and was now standing close enough to read in full. "What would you like to say?" I said. He was quiet for a moment. "I would like to say," he said, with the careful deliberateness of a person choosing words for their precision rather than their effect, "that I am grateful, genuinely and specifically. Not in the formal language of official gratitude, which I have given a great deal of, and which carries a weight of obligation that tends to turn a simple thing complicated. Personally, from one person to another." I held his gaze. "Thank you," he said. And it was, as I had come to expect from him, entirely simple. No performance, no excess. Just the true shape of a thing, offered plainly. "You are welcome," I said. We stood in that corridor for a moment, in the quiet of a morning that had resolved into something neither of us had quite planned for, and I thought about everything that had happened in the last 12 hours, and everything that would need to be addressed in the hours that followed, and the practical realities of what it meant for a serving girl to have sat at the treaty table of the Northern Pax and been told to sit there by the man who ruled them. There were things I did not yet know. There were things I suspected. There was a question in his gray eyes that was not the one he had just asked, and that I did not think he would ask today, and that I found, somewhat to my own surprise, I did not mind waiting for. I was 22 years old. I had been invisible for a long time. I had the particular feeling, standing in that corridor with the morning light coming through the narrow slit window at the far end, and the keep moving around us in its ordinary sounds, of a person who has just become, irrevocably, and with no possibility of returning to the previous arrangement, something other than invisible. It was not comfortable in the way that familiar things are comfortable. It was something better than that. It was true. And if you have made it here, to the end of this story, to the quiet corridor, and the morning light, and the thing that has not yet been said between them but will be, then you already know what kind of person you are. You are the kind of person who stays for the whole thing, who does not leave when it gets difficult, who wants to know what the ring was, and what the note said, and what happens in a keep after the traitor is removed, and the treaty is signed, and a girl who carried plates for a living is no longer the same person she was the morning before. There are more stories where this one came from. Subscribe to this channel right now, if you have not yet done so. Turn on the notification bell so that you do not miss what comes next. Every week we bring you the kind of story that does not let you go, the kind you think about after the video ends, the kind that makes you want to stay for one more. She sat at that table in a gray dress. She walked that hall alone. She kept the ring for 3 weeks without knowing what it was, and when she knew, she kept it anyway, because she had been told to stay alive. There is more to her story. Come back for it. Extended content. The night in cell 4 was the longest of my life. Not because of fear, though the cold was genuine, and the dark was the particular pressing dark of underground stone that carries its own specific quality, heavier than ordinary dark, as though the weight of the keep above you is transmitted downward into the air itself. It was long because of thought. I am not, by nature, a person who avoids thinking. Some people, when faced with difficult circumstances, find distraction in movement or noise, or the company of others. I do not have that mechanism. When something requires understanding, I sit with it until I understand it, and the understanding is the only thing that quiets the part of my mind that will not let difficult things rest. So I thought about the ring, about the cord at my neck, where it had been for 3 weeks, sitting against my sternum in the ordinary way of an object so familiar that you stop registering it. I thought about how many times in 3 weeks I had touched it, adjusting the cord, feeling its weight shift when I bent over a table, and had not once thought about what it was or who it might belong to, because I had removed it from an unconscious stranger's hand to keep it safe, and the keeping of it was simply what I was doing. I thought about what it meant that someone had been looking for it for 3 weeks without finding it. I thought about Aldrich, about the 20 seconds outside the linen storeroom. 2 voices, one of them his. The exchange that I had registered and filed and tried to forget about, and had not been able to. I had caught a fragment about a secondary document, a fragment about the boundary provisions, a fragment about what the seal was worth without the formal proceedings, which I had understood in the practical way of someone who works in a political household and absorbs vocabulary without always understanding its full weight. The seal gave authority to anything it stamped. That was the currency. I thought about the fact that Aldrich had pressed a replica into my apron pocket in the corridor that morning, in the moment when we had passed each other by the east stairs. A contact so brief and so practiced that I had not registered it as contact at all at the time. I thought about what kind of man learned that skill. The answer was the kind who had practiced it deliberately, who had spent time making himself capable of inserting something into another person's clothing without their awareness, which was not a casual acquisition. I thought about what I was going to do. The answer kept returning to the same shape, no matter how I approached it. I had the real ring. I was the only person in the keep who could produce it in the morning's proceedings. Calder knew I had it, and Calder's note had told me to stay alive, which meant Calder intended to use me at some point before the morning concluded, which meant I needed to be present for the morning proceedings, and functional, and in a position where what I did would be visible to the assembled delegations. All of that required one thing from me between now and then: patience. I lay down on the stone ledge. I pulled my knees to my chest and breathed steadily, and I waited for Calder to come, because I believed he would come, and because there was nothing else useful to do. He came at midnight, as I have already said. What I have not said is this. When he entered the cell and stood against the opposite wall in the small space that smelled of cold stone and torch smoke, and looked at me with those gray eyes that I had been reading for the first time at close range, I had the disorienting experience of seeing him as both things at once. The king, whose face I had catalogued from a distance across 7 formal occasions, and whose authority shaped the entire structure of the world I worked inside, and the man from the passage, unconscious on cold ground, breathing badly, whose hand I had touched without ceremony in the dark. Both things at once. It was the second one that made the first bearable. I had seen him when he was not performing anything, when he was only what he was at the most functional core, stripped of context and authority, and the careful management of impression that powerful people develop over years of being watched. What was there, underneath, was not what I had expected, and not what the architecture of his public face would have suggested. What was? There was stillness, and beneath the stillness, something that recognized being helped by a person who did not expect to be compensated for it, and felt the specific weight of that recognition. I thought about all of this while he told me what he needed for the morning. I thought about it while I fell asleep. Finally, near the 3rd hour, on a stone ledge in a dungeon, with the ring on its cord returned to its place at my throat. The cord retied with the same knot I always used. I slept better than I expected. The morning light through the narrow slit in the upper wall of the east corridor was gray and cold when I woke. I sat up. The torch in the passage outside had burned low. The keep above was beginning to move. The distant sounds of the earliest risers, the kitchen staff who began work before any other hour, the clatter of iron pots and the smell of wood smoke that found its way even down to the dungeon level, through the old stone channels. I straightened my dress. I pressed my palms against my hair, doing what I could without a mirror. I dusted the stone dust from the gray fabric and checked that the cord at my neck was secure. Then I walked out of the open cell and up the dungeon stairs and back into the world. No one stopped me. The corridor outside the dungeon entrance was empty at that hour. I moved through the keep with the particular navigation of someone who has spent 5 years learning its geography, the fastest routes, the least trafficked passages, the times of day when certain corridors could be traversed without encountering supervision. I found the small washroom off the east kitchen, used the basin, dried my face on a clean cloth from the stack I knew would be folded on the upper shelf. I did not change my dress, because I had no other dress to change into, and because there was a logic to arriving at the treaty, signing in the same clothes I had worn when I was publicly accused, the same gray dress and white apron, the specificity of an unchanged detail, making a statement that a different outfit would have diluted. I found Wren in the east kitchen, and I told her I needed to be in the assembly hall. She looked at me for a long moment. "You look terrible," she said. "I know," I said. She gave me a tray of water pitchers. I walked to the assembly hall. What happened there, I have already told. The walking of that room, the ring placed in my palm, the tray set down on the table in front of the Western aide at precisely the moment when the replica would have been produced, the moment Calder and I had time together in the cell the previous night. What I have not told is the moment just before I walked toward the head of the table. The aide had looked at the ring in my hand with the expression of a man whose plan has just encountered something it did not account for. The expression lasted perhaps 2 seconds, long enough for me to understand that he had spent months on this arrangement, that he had been present at every meeting where the seal was discussed, that he had made calculations about risk and return that had seemed solid and had just revealed their fundamental error. I did not feel satisfaction in that moment. I want to be accurate about this. What I felt was the particular clarity of doing the thing you have decided to do, without the noise of other feelings getting in the way. The same quality of action that I had felt 3 weeks ago when I crouched in a dark passage and made a practical assessment and acted on it. I turned and walked toward the head of the table. Every eye in the room followed me. I placed the ring down in front of Calder. He rose, and then he said the thing that made the Western delegate's face go the particular white of someone who has just understood that the ground beneath the entire arrangement has dissolved. He said, "She held this for me. 4 words. Simple. True. The kind of statement that carries more weight than its syntax would suggest, because of everything it implies, about what had happened, about what was known, about what had been planned for months, and had failed in the space of a single morning, in a stone keep in the Northern Territories. 4 words, and then Brennan was moving, and Aldrich's face was doing the thing it could not prevent, and the Western delegate was beginning the quiet recalculation of a practical man who has survived in difficult politics by knowing when to adjust position. I sat where Calder told me to sit. I folded my hands. I breathed. In the days that followed, things changed in the way that things change when a significant shift has occurred. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic gesture, but in the accumulation of small adjustments that, taken together, add up to something unmistakable. Wren reassigned me from the East Corridor service to a role within the inner household staff. She did not explain the change in terms of anything that had happened, which was characteristic of her management style, practical, and without ceremony. The change happened, and I did not question it. The formal investigation of the theft charge was closed within 24 hours. The documentation noted that the item had been in the authorized possession of a household staff member during a period of emergency service, and had been returned to the Crown upon completion of the relevant proceedings. The language was careful and colorless, and served its purpose. Aldrich did not run. He requested a formal audience with the council, and entered a full account of what he had arranged, and why, delivered with the flat precision of a man who had calculated that cooperation was now his only remaining option. The council proceedings took 3 days. I was not present for them, though I was aware of their progress through the ordinary networks of a large household. the way information moves through kitchens and corridors, and the overheard edges of conversations. The Western delegation departed on the second day, with the formal treaty signed in its original terms, the boundary provisions unchanged, the compact seal affixed to the document in the presence of all parties. The silver-haired delegate passed me in the east corridor on his way out. He looked at me for 1 second, with an expression I could not fully read, some compound of reassessment and resignation, and then he walked past without speaking. I continued in my work. On the 4th day, a formal letter arrived through the household administrative channel, addressed to me by name, in a handwriting I recognized. It contained 3 sentences. The first said that the council had ruled, and the matter was formally concluded. The second said that my service to the Crown was noted in the official record. The third said simply, "When you are ready to know the rest, come to the North Tower study. Any morning. The door will be open." I folded the letter. I placed it in the pocket of my apron. I finished my shift. I thought about it for 2 days, in the careful way I thought about things that required honest consideration rather than immediate response. On the morning of the 3rd day, I went to the North Tower study. The door was open. He was at the desk, working, and he looked up when I appeared in the doorway, with the same gray-eyed attention that had become, over the past week, a thing I recognized as specific to me, aimed at me, not the general assessment of a room, but the particular attention of a person who has decided to notice someone. He said, "Sit down." I sat down, and the thing that had not yet been said began, slowly, in the way that true things tend to begin, without announcement and without ceremony, simply by starting. There was more to know. There is always more to know. And I was no longer the person who decided she could not afford to ask.